Spring 1864, Virginia was still defiant. For 3 years, the major Union Army had surged and blasted its way toward the Confederate capital at Richmond. Outnumbered Southerners had defeated each Federal offensive. And now, in the third spring of the Civil War, the North got a new general-in-chief. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. His friends called him Sam. Grant announced that in the past, the various Union armies had, in his words, acted independently and without concert, like a bulky wagon team, no two horses ever pulling together. This had enabled the Confederates to shift soldiers from one sector to another to meet the most immediate danger. Grant was convinced that if he applied constant pressure everywhere, the forces of General R.E. Lee would collapse. Frederick the Great had said it well in another age. He who attempts to defend everything ends up defending nothing. Hence, in May 1864, Grant sent one Union army under General Franz Sigel into the Shenandoah Valley to seize that agriculturally rich and strategically vital region. A second Union army under General Benjamin F. Butler would advance from Norfolk along the south bank of the James River toward Richmond and Petersburg. Meanwhile, Grant and the Army of the Potomac, 121,500 strong, would cross the Rapidan River in northern Virginia and head south against Lee's 62,000 tattered soldiers. Grant intended to make contact with the Southern Army and continue fighting until something broke, all the time moving in the general direction of Richmond. The month that followed was indescribably bloody for both Lee and Grant. The Union Army took some of the heaviest losses of the war. 2 days of combat in the wilderness, 11 days of fighting at Spotsylvania, another 2-day struggle at the North Anna River, left fields scorched and land stained by death. Generals fell in bunches and included the so-called eyes of Lee's army, General Jeff Stuart, who was mortally wounded in a cavalry battle at Yellow Tavern. In that month of May, Grant suffered over 50,000 casualties, almost as many men as Lee had at the beginning of the campaign. Lee's losses were 32,000 men, half of his army. Meanwhile, Butler and his Union Army of the James had marched straight into defeat.
In May 1864, on the eve of the Petersburg campaign, the most heavily fortified spot on the James River was here at Drewry's Bluff. Drewry's Bluff had heard the guns before. 2 years earlier, in May 1862, as part of General George McClellan's first Union advance on Richmond, a Union gunboat fleet headed by the mightiest new experimental ironclads, the Galena, the new Ironsides, and the USS Monitor, had come up the James River in support of McClellan's overland operation. What stopped them was this place right here, Drewry's Bluff, the first high ground just 7 miles south of Richmond on the James, and an ideal place to locate shore batteries. Those Union gunboats took a pounding. The Galena was perforated, the Monitor was virtually forced out of action, and the naval approach to Richmond simply failed. 2 years later, this area was still to have a role to play in the Petersburg campaign. While Grant envisioned moving south against Lee in northern Virginia, it was going to be the task of another Union general to move his forces up the Virginia Peninsula to threaten Richmond and Petersburg from the south. The man chosen for the job was portly, cockeyed old Ben Butler, a Democratic machine politician from Massachusetts who had no great military skill, but he'd acquired considerable seniority, and unfortunately for Grant, was a man whom he could not shunt aside. So Butler had command of the Army of the James, more than 40,000 men. And on May 5th, the very same time that Grant and Lee are first engaging each other in the wilderness battles, Butler lands his army of 40,000 men at Bermuda Landing, just a few miles south, to start to threaten Richmond and Petersburg. But unfortunately, like so many of these inexperienced men, Butler will advance and then lose his nerve. And so he stops for several days, leaving the initiative to the Confederate defender at Petersburg, Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard, the hero of Fort Sumter and of First Manassas. Beauregard assembled a scratch force of scarcely 20,000 Confederates and set out to save the Confederate capital. His notion was to send a decoy force down here to Drewry's Bluff, out exposed presumably to try to lure Butler into attacking him. And that's exactly what happened. Butler moved north, but he did so hesitantly. And when he made his first feints at Drewry's Bluff around May 12th, May 13th, he very quickly pulled back, at which time Beauregard moved the entire balance of his 20,000 men here to Fort Darling at Drewry's Bluff, and on May 16th, early in the morning, in a fog, he sent forth his attack in two waves, one on Butler's right and the other on Butler's left. And in fierce fighting that cost more than 4,500 Union casualties, but 2,000 Confederate casualties as well, Butler was pushed back. By May 17th, the battle was over. Butler would withdraw down to Bermuda 100, a peninsula ringed on three sides by the James River, and when he put himself inside that bottle, Beauregard had only to move south and close off the landward opening of it, thus putting the cork in the bottle and leaving Butler bottled up in Bermuda 100 and virtually out of the Petersburg campaign just when Grant needed him most. The first attempt to take Petersburg and Richmond from the south had failed. Now it was up to Grant.
The two opposing generals stood in sharp contrast to one another. Robert E. Lee was a premier soldier of the present and the past. A son of Virginia aristocracy, highly educated, brilliant in military science and engineering, the 57-year-old Lee was strikingly handsome, dignified, ever courteous. His soldiers looked on him as a second father. They called him Marse Robert out of sheer devotion, and they were willing to attempt anything he asked. His opponent, 42-year-old Sam Grant, was a part of New America. He was a Midwestern yeoman stock, unaffected by or even interested in the past. Grant was stooped and slouchy, with the look of a man who had come way up from very far down. He spent more time chewing on a cigar than talking. Nothing about Grant was inspirational, except his Civil War record. He had won smashing victories at Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, Lookout Mountain, and Missionary Ridge. Success came through a stubborn tenacity of grabbing hold of an opponent and not letting go. A Wisconsin private, after seeing Grant for the first time, was asked what he thought. The soldier paused for a moment, then replied, "He looks as if he meant it." By the end of the horrible May 1864 fighting in Virginia, both generals were in a mixed situation. Lee's ill-equipped army had been hammered unmercifully, with battle losses staggering in every sense. The future promised little relief. And yet Richmond, the heart of the Confederacy, was still safe. Grant's forces had suffered so many killed and wounded that northern newspapers had labeled their general the Sledgehammer and the Butcher. Grant was no closer to Richmond than General George McClellan had been 2 years earlier. Still, the little general from Illinois could replace his losses from the huge population base of the North. His mighty army lacked nothing for supplies, and Lee was no offensive threat so long as Grant kept him pinned down with attacks. In mid-May, Lee told his generals, "We must destroy this army of Grant's before he gets to the James River. If he gets there, it will become a siege, and then it will be a mere question of time." And precisely as Lee was speaking, Grant was declaring, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." Neither side gave any thought to retreat.
Even as Lee perhaps began to realize that at last he'd met his match in Grant, still he'd seen enough of the Yankee chieftain's thinking and action to know that his foe would once again try to swing around his own right flank to separate the Army of Northern Virginia from Richmond. Lee's only hope of countering that was to augment his army sufficiently to meet the threat in force, and if he could not stop Grant's advance entirely, at least he could try to be prepared to meet the Federals on the most advantageous ground possible. That now meant the crossroads village of Cold Harbor, which Grant's army would have to pass through and which offered Lee some good ground to defend. Lee sent his nephew, General Fitzhugh Lee, to Cold Harbor to hold it with his cavalry, while ordering General Robert Hoke's infantry, recently arrived from North Carolina, to speed to the village to support the cavalry. Then Lee began to shift his own infantry in the same direction. Unfortunately, Lee could do nothing in secret, for the armies were virtually in sight of one another now, with reconnaissance so frequent and thorough that one could scarcely sneeze without the other army catching cold. Grant easily read Lee's move and responded by sending Philip Sheridan and his cavalry to take Cold Harbor. Sheridan found Fitzhugh Lee waiting for him and drove him out on May 31st, but then ran into the infantry that was hastily flowing to the crossroads. Sheridan hesitated, uncertain, and pulled back. And that gave Lee vital time to shift the rest of his army, so that by June 1st, he was in line and waiting for what came next.
In a real sense, the siege of Petersburg begins here, northeast of Richmond, at a vital road junction that was neither chilly nor was it near water, yet it was called Cold Harbor. For almost a month, General Ulysses Grant had tried to interpose his army between the forces of Lee and the Confederate capital at Richmond. All efforts had failed. Late in May, Grant and Lee both arrived in this area. Both quickly dug in and prepared for battle. And so on the night of June 2nd, Grant issued orders for a frontal attack at dawn against the very center of Lee's line. It was an impossible assignment, and the Union soldiers who were to make it knew it. Throughout the night, those Billy Yanks all did the same thing as they awaited dawn in the attack. They wrote their names and addresses on little pieces of paper and pinned them to the backs of their shirts. So after the attack, the burial details would be able to make quick and ready identification of their bodies.
I'm standing in the Confederate trench line at Cold Harbor. On the morning of June 3rd, 1864, the Confederate Army had constructed over 6 miles of entrenchments to defend their position on the battlefield. At 4:30 that morning, Union forces were ordered to assault. The main attack lasted less than an hour, and in that time, close to 5,000 Union soldiers fell, many of them killed and wounded. When the day was over, there were close to 7,000 Union casualties, and just slightly over 1,000 Confederates fell in the defense.
The hardest task for the Union Army that day fell to the men of General William Baldy Smith's 18th Corps. These veterans had to come out of the woods, sweep across open country that went down and then up, and then advance straight into the face of concentrated Confederate artillery and infantry fire. The 18th Corps would be virtually cremated. One of scores of stories told about Cold Harbor has to do with a Union soldier known only as Private Maddox. After that horrible battle, a Federal colonel was staggering back across the field, himself wounded, when he heard a feeble cry. He looked over and saw a young teenage soldier lying on the ground, mortally wounded, he having been eviscerated by an artillery shell. The colonel went over expecting the boy to pass along some farewell message to his parents. Instead, the young soldier looked up at the colonel and said, "Colonel, is the day ours? Is the day ours?" And the colonel just could not bring himself to tell the lad of the horrible defeat they had suffered. So he lied. "Yes, my son," he said, "the day is ours. We are victorious. We have carried the field." Then said Private Maddox, "I am willing to die." And he did die. And he is buried here at Cold Harbor, where he gave his life for his country.
The fight at Cold Harbor would be one of the most controversial of the war, and still today one of the most misunderstood. On the morning of June 1st, with more of his infantry now at hand, Lee tried unsuccessfully to retake Cold Harbor from the Union cavalry, who were soon replaced by Grant's 6th Corps, commanded by General Horatio Wright. Unfortunately, Wright delayed in following up his advantage. That, and the inevitable mistakes and confusion behind blue lines, led to a delay in moving against Lee's main line. It was late afternoon before the Federals attacked, and that had given Lee time to get 2 divisions of infantry in line and well placed. They repulsed Wright's 6 divisions and inflicted more than 2,500 casualties while holding their own ground. But worse was to come. Hearing of the bungled attack, Grant that evening ordered General Winfield Scott Hancock to force march his 2nd Corps to the field overnight to help renew the assault. In the heat and the dust of the early summer, Hancock's men couldn't make the pace. Grant was forced to postpone the attack until June 2nd. That gave Lee even more time, and when 40,000 men of the Army of the Potomac finally made their attack at 4:30 a.m. in the morning, Lee's entire army was in place in what some believe was the finest defensive position that army ever held. When it came, certainly the attack was the most calamitous half hour for the war of the Union. The attackers were driven back with awful losses. Legend and history have put the number of casualties at 7,000, an exaggeration recently reduced substantially by careful research. But still, Grant's army suffered badly. Indeed, there were later accusations that casualty reports were intentionally withheld from Union newspapers for fear that the news of the awful losses would weaken Northern morale. Once again, Lee had stymied Grant. Lee had stymied Grant's every effort in the Overland Campaign from the day it began on May 5th. Day after day, week after week, Grant had tried to get around Lee's right flank, and day after day, Lee had stopped him. Finally, at Cold Harbor, he had stopped him cold. But Grant didn't do what so many before him had done. He didn't turn around and go back. Being Grant, he just kept trying to find another way. Yet this time, he embarked on perhaps the most audacious move of a career that was marked by imaginative and audacious moves. He decided not just to get his army over Lee's flank, but to get it completely across the James River without Lee knowing it. The James River here is 2,200 feet across, 2/5 of a mile. Grant would have his engineers at work overnight, erecting a pontoon bridge to span it. The pontoon bridge is as old as military history. It's a simple idea. A few boats anchored in a stream, connected by planks, and the army can march across. But no one had ever built a pontoon bridge 2,200 feet across. Grant's men did it in less than 48 hours. On June 12th, he began pulling his forces out of their lines in front of Lee at Cold Harbor, and by stealth and by night, managed to get them in the next several days here to the bridge, where on June 14th through 17th he crossed virtually his entire army, and Lee still didn't know where Grant was. Maybe the only time in the war, a Yankee foeman had stolen a march on the great Robert E. Lee. And as of June 17th, Lee's army was on this side of the James, Grant's army was on the other side, and the race for Petersburg was on.
Petersburg lay on the south bank of the Appomattox River, a few miles from the place where the Appomattox emptied into the James. It was the second largest city in Virginia and a major supply depot. Petersburg had to be held if Richmond was to be protected, because all but one of the railroads coming up with supplies through the Carolinas passed through Petersburg. It was, in essence, the soft underbelly of the entire Virginia military theater. In mid-June, Grant actually won the race for the town. While Lee was seeking to determine Grant's next move, some 14,000 Union troops advanced unopposed to the outskirts of Petersburg. Defending the town were no more than 2,000 soldiers, home guard and convalescents, under General P.G.T. Beauregard. Federals overran 3 miles of the outer lines of defenses. Then they stopped at the site of the main earthworks guarding Petersburg. Constructed in 1862 by slaves under the supervision of engineer Charles Dimmock, the defenses consisted of 10 miles of imposing earthworks, 6 feet high, along with redoubts or square forts that could accommodate 200 cannon. A huge ditch in front of the works acted as a moat. Adjoining it was a slashing of felled trees anchored in places by interlaced branches. Beyond was a half-mile of open ground that could be swept by Confederate fire from earthworks in nearby woods. The Dimmock line was formidable indeed, but it was thinly manned. By June 16, Grant had the Confederates outnumbered by 25 to 1, and yet Union generals failed to demonstrate alertness and alacrity in carrying out attack orders. Winfield Scott Hancock, for example, was in severe pain from a Gettysburg wound that would not heal. William F. Smith concluded that waiting for reinforcements was better than attacking alone, despite the fact that time was of the essence. The Union Army as a whole was exhausted from 6 weeks of marching, fighting, and losing. The 3 days of critical Union attacks at Petersburg were poorly coordinated and badly executed. Beauregard waged a stubborn defense in what was his highest achievement in the Civil War. By June 18th, Lee's army was on the scene. Grant had stumbled, Lee had reacted quickly, and the war in front of Petersburg and Richmond now turned into a strange sort of siege. The Confederates were not surrounded or cut off from supplies. They were safe in the Petersburg earthworks. On the other hand, they could not get out. The smaller army's principal asset, mobility, was gone. One of the Confederacy's worst enemies would become time. As one of Lee's generals observed, however bold we might be, however desperately we might fight, we were sure in the end to be worn out.
No sooner had Grant completed the crossing of the James than he identified this spot, City Point, Virginia as the ideal location for a supply base to manage his campaign to take Petersburg and Richmond. It was very important, vital indeed, from a communications, transportation, and supply point of view. Up to my right, the Appomattox River flowed into the James, which continues on up toward Richmond over my left shoulder. That gave Grant a connection both to send movement of men and material down the Appomattox or up the James so he could cover both the move on Petersburg and the move on Richmond. At the same time, there was an old and somewhat derelict railroad here called the City Point Railroad that Grant quickly put his military engineers to work on in revitalizing, rebuilding, and strengthening so that he could use it as well to move troops and men and supplies off toward Petersburg in this growing, massively expanding siege to take Petersburg in a campaign that's going to last almost 10 months. Grant establishes his headquarters here on June 15th and will stay here for the next 9.5 months. The buildup is dramatic. It becomes the biggest Union supply base in the course of the war. Half a mile worth of wharves off down to the south will see ships coming in at the rate of sometimes as many as 150 a day, offloading food, material, soldiers, weapons, equipment, everything needed for this enormous modern army operating here. Shops were set up all over the area, farriers' shops, blacksmiths' shops, construction shops, a military prison, bakeries. The bakers here at City Point, by the end of the siege, were producing 133,000 loaves of bread every day to feed the Union soldiers. Sometimes the bread was getting to them while it was still warm. It's one of the marvels of the modern Union military machine here at City Point, and this is one of the prime reasons that Grant was able to move this campaign with such efficiency over such a long and sustained campaign.
In the ensuing weeks, Union cavalry slashed at railroads and clashed with Southern horsemen. Infantry on both sides constructed parallel, intricate systems of trench networks. From east of Richmond to southeast of Petersburg, the land became a network of zigzagging ditches, never closer than 100 yards, and accentuated here and there with menacing artillery emplacements. Morale was comparatively high on the Confederate side. Discouragement was widespread throughout the North. Lee's army had not been broken, Richmond had not been taken, and no American had ever seen anything like the endless casualty lists appearing weekly. While Grant gained little and Butler achieved nothing, the third federal threat into Virginia initially accomplished only disaster in the Shenandoah Valley. General Franz Sigel's offensive ended at Newmarket when a hodgepodge Confederate force, with the Virginia Military Institute Corps of Cadets in support, soundly whipped the invaders. A second Union effort under General David Hunter fared no better in the valley beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains. After Confederates from the valley made a threat on Washington, Grant turned to one of his ablest lieutenants. "Do all the damage you can," he told General Philip Sheridan. "If the war is to last another year, we want the Shenandoah Valley to be a barren waste." By October, Sheridan had succeeded. His campaign is known locally as the Burning. Many writers emphasize similarities between Sheridan's conduct in the valley and William T. Sherman's destruction in Georgia. Many odd things happened in the American Civil War. None was more unique nor produced a greater battle than what occurred here at Petersburg on July 30th, 1864. At one point, the opposing lines were barely 150 yards apart. And manning the Union portion of that line was the 48th Pennsylvania, most of whose soldiers were coal miners from the Schuylkill area of the Keystone State. Their colonel was Henry Pleasants, a mining engineer with considerable experience in building railroad tunnels. Pleasants came up with an idea. Why not construct a tunnel extending from the Union lines all the way underneath no man's land to beneath the Confederate lines? And at the end of that tunnel, the Union Army would place an immense amount of gunpowder. They would mass troops, and at a given signal, the gunpowder would explode, the Confederate line would be broken, the Union Army could sweep forward in a victorious assault and break Lee's lines here at Petersburg. Well, work began on the tunnel late in June. And the 48th Pennsylvania discovered that while the Union Army approved of the plan, it would give no help to it. The soldiers in the 48th had to secure their own picks and shovels. They had to cut their own timber to make the shoring for the ceilings and the walls. They even had to construct their own wheelbarrows to carry the dirt out. And yet, in the amazingly short time of 3.5 weeks, they constructed a tunnel that extended 510 feet from the Union lines to 20 feet underneath the Confederate position. After they had dug the tunnel itself, the 48th then constructed a perpendicular shaft that extended 75 feet each way, so that the finished result resembled a giant T with a long shank and a short cross section. Into the end of that tunnel, Union soldiers placed 320 kegs containing 8,000 pounds of gunpowder. And early on the morning of July 30th, everything was set for the assault. Colonel Pleasance lit the fuse at 3 a.m. It was expected to detonate the powder at 3:30. 3:30 came, nothing happened. 3:45, 4 o'clock, 4:15, something was wrong. A sergeant in the 48th Pennsylvania volunteered to crawl up into the tunnel to ascertain the problem. Sergeant Henry Reese went about 400 feet and he found that one of the splicings had come loose. He respliced the fuse, dashed for safety, and then at 4:45 it happened. The earth began to shake, there was a deep rumble, and suddenly the entire Confederate hillside exploded as flame and smoke and dirt spewed heavenward. House-sized clods of dirt, pieces of ammunition and artillery, pieces of human flesh flew in every direction. Over here on the Union side, a Massachusetts soldier was so awed by it all that he commented, "We have witnessed a volcano and experienced an earthquake."
Unfortunately, the attack was left to General Ambrose Burnside and his 9th Corps. The 9th Corps had always been a hard-luck command, and worse, Burnside had always been a commander who usually disappointed. His first choice to spearhead the attack was a fresh division, commanded by General Edward Ferrero. The problem was they were too fresh. They had no combat experience. Furthermore, there was a political dimension to the problem because this was a dimension of black troops. If they made this attack and they failed, that would lend weight to those in the North who'd say blacks would not fight, which of course Grant and Meade knew was not true. Perhaps even worse, if they came into this attack and it proved to be a fiasco, there would be those who would say the blacks had been thrown in as cannon fodder to save white troops. So at the 11th hour, just the day before the attack, the order came down to Burnside not to start with Ferrero's division, but to use one of his others. And unfortunately, in true Burnside fashion, he avoided making a decision by allowing others to make it for him, and the decision fell to the division of General James Ledlie, one of the worst commanders in the Union Army, even though his was a good division. The morning the attack was to be launched, Ledlie was back in his bomb-proof getting drunk, leaving his division virtually to themselves. Then came the explosion. The explosion itself completely disconcerted many of the attacking Federals. They had never seen anything like it in their lives. They came over the brow of this slip, tons of earth all around, perhaps 200 tons of Virginia soil, cannon, and 300 South Carolinians had been sent up in the air and come back down, and what they found here was a hole almost 180 feet wide, nearly 50 to 60 feet across, and in places 30 feet deep. At first they just looked down in wonderment at what was here. Piles of cannon, huge chunks of earth, bits and pieces of Confederate bodies sticking out of the soil. And then once they got over the shock, they pushed forward, down into the crater and up over the far lip, hoping that they were going to find ahead of them an easy field of advance between Confederate lines. What they saw instead was a maze, a rabbit's warren of communications trenches and bomb-proofs. Before long, the Confederates began to reform. The South Carolina regiments that had been cut in half began to regroup and started mounting some kind of a defense back behind the crater. And then as the morning wore on, the confusion never ceased. And the Union commanders back in their own lines did very little to remedy the situation. Burnside will order Ferrero's division of black troops in, but Ferrero won't accompany them. He'll join Ledlie in the bomb-proof and share another convivial glass, leaving his soldiers virtually on their own as well. And regiment after regiment simply crowds into the crater before trying to move forward. At one point, after about 2 hours have passed, there was something like 10,000 men congregated inside the crater. And then the Confederates start to move up and start to counterattack. And as the Confederates react and move in more men and more guns, the Yankee soldiers find it's just as hard and just as deadly trying to retreat the other way. They are trapped. It's almost 8 hours before the battle for the crater is finally over, and when it is, 4,500 Union soldiers are casualties, only 1,500 Confederates are casualties, and this great plan that some thought might have been a wonderful opportunity had come to naught. Charles Francis Adams said the thing was a wonderful success, except for the fact that it failed.
A major byproduct of the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation was the opportunity to enlist former slaves into the Union Army. In all, about 185,000 blacks, the numerical equivalent of 3 full armies, donned federal uniforms. Their conduct at such earlier battles as Port Hudson, Louisiana, and Fort Wagner, South Carolina, had brought praise, both genuine and grudging, from Union authorities. Virginia was the last military theater to see black soldiers. By the summer of 1864, 2 all-black divisions were in the field at Petersburg. Most of those soldiers were ex-slaves, illiterate, and accustomed to servile obedience. How good they were depended in great part on the white officers who led them. Many of their officers initially left much to be desired. Blacks saw their first action in Virginia on June 15th at a segment of the line known as Baylor's Farm. One division dashed up a hill, drove away the defenders, but could not advance farther. Yet the blacks captured a piece of artillery. Thereafter, blacks would be conspicuous in a number of Virginia engagements, including the crater at Petersburg and Newmarket Heights at Richmond. The Atlantic Monthly stated of black soldiers after one battle, "Through the cannon smoke of that dark night, the manhood of the colored race shines before many eyes that heretofore would not see."
Usually a siege does not just begin, as if by intent. Rather, it tends to evolve as the combatants become increasingly static in response to events. As Grant and Lee settled into a siege for Petersburg and Richmond, both armies were simply too exhausted to keep maneuvering in the field, and they had run out of field to keep maneuvering in. Lee could fall back no farther, and going into the already prepared extensive field fortifications was his only alternative. Earthworks were nothing new either, to warfare in general or to this war in particular. Grant himself had encountered rebel works at Corinth, Mississippi, and himself laid siege to Vicksburg, but nothing before matched the scale of Petersburg's miles of trenches, redans, and forts on the so-called Dimmock Line. What was new was that neither of these armies had endured a siege before. The monotony, the inactivity, the inevitable diseases that came from the damp trenches and bomb-proofs, with the exception of a few flashes of engagements, usually on the outer flanks of the lines, the action was confined to snipers firing back and forth, chiefly to occupy themselves and try to keep heads down on the other side. Sometimes the works approached to within no more than 100 yards of each other, while the artillery of both sides could make trench life all the more risky, especially with the plunging fire from huge mortars like the massive 13-inch siege mortar that the Yankees dubbed the Dictator. And always they were digging, their weapons now picks and shovels, or axes to fell trees. Works, or portions of works, would eventually stretch out for more than 30 miles, and often in threatened places the Confederate defenses would be 2 and 3 lines deep, with forts and redoubts placed at angles wherever the ground changed direction. The boredom told on both armies, especially with men who enlisted to fight, disillusioned that now they were becoming what some termed moles and gophers. No wonder desertion began to grow, especially from the Confederate Army. Accustomed to maneuvering and marching, to taking the war to the enemy, the Army of Northern Virginia was now reduced to sitting and waiting, and as so many knew, for the South, the waiting game was a losing game. And now here to describe more of the detail of the construction and layout of the defenses and the siege works of Petersburg is our good friend, historian A. Wilson Greene.
The campaign for Petersburg lasted some 9.5 months, covering 272 days of combat. The primary reason it lasted so long is here behind me. The elements of the siege fortifications that both armies constructed for a distance of 45 miles running from northeast of Richmond to southwest of Petersburg. The first thing the armies did was to clear a field of fire, and then they erected a series of obstacles to keep the enemy at bay. Immediately behind me is a row of tangled tree limbs called abattis, designed to slow down an attacking force at optimum rifle range. Beyond the abattis was a field of stumps, the very trees that were used to build the fortifications themselves. Often the armies would string telegraph wire between the stumps as trip hazards. Beyond that, the pointed stakes of the frays, another obstacle designed to stop an attacking force at absolute point-blank range. And if by some chance an attacker was able to breach all these obstacles, they had to go down into an 8-foot deep moat and then scale the walls of a steep 12-foot parapet. It's easy to see from the other side of the fortifications why the soldiers called these devices earthworks. But on this side of the fortifications, the defensive side, you can see that they were primarily made out of logs. The soldiers would stand behind a 6-foot-high parapet or revetment of logs, which would shield them from regular infantry or artillery fire. They also utilized the banket or firing step to reload their weapons as they stepped down to be completely out of range. During their idle hours, and there were many idle hours during the Petersburg campaign, the soldiers would participate in the construction of other defensive equipment, such as chevaux de frise or gabions used to strengthen the fortifications. With strong fortifications like these, it's easy to understand why Lee's army, outnumbered almost 2 to 1, was able to sustain a campaign for nearly 10 months.
Grant had a strong grip on Lee's army. He was painfully aware of the costs of a frontal attack. Hence, in the summer and autumn, Grant sought to sever the railroads supplying Lee and to hit the flanks that were the Confederate weak points. Piecemeal assaults and heroic counterattacks became the norm. Major fighting occurred August 18th at Globe Tavern and a week later at Reams Station. Confederates under General A.P. Hill repulsed the attacks. Late in September, Federals broke through the outer defenses at lightly manned Fort Harrison in front of Richmond. This success threw the capital into its greatest danger of the war. However, General Butler's weak punches and a strong Confederate defense at the next line of earthworks saved the day. A month later, Grant's men got an initial advantage along the Boynton Plank Road southwest of Petersburg, but could not exploit it. The truth of the matter was that the faces of both armies were changing. A major reason behind the Union reverses was a change in Army makeup. It is an axiom of warfare that the first men to rush to arms are the best. Progressively, after 1862, the quality of the new men coming into the Union armies gradually declined. The exceptions, of course, were the young men just attaining enlistment age. By late 1864, the new Billy Yanks in front of Petersburg were substitutes, draftees, and men bought with bounties. They performed poorly and sapped much of the luster from the proud Army of the Potomac. Across the way, the Army of Northern Virginia was slowly evaporating. Lee pointed out in September, "We have no troops disposable to meet movements of the enemy or strike when opportunity presents without taking them from the trenches and thus exposing some important point." As Grant slowly extended his lines, Lee was forced to do the same. And the longer the Confederate line became, the less men there were to defend its total length. Years in found Union and Confederate lines stretched from the Williamsburg Road east of Richmond 35 miles to Hatch's Run, southwest of Petersburg. Grant had a stranglehold on Lee's army. Henceforth, it would be a war of nerves, a test of endurance. It was the very thing that Lee had always feared, a siege with hunger, exposure, disease, desertion, sickness, allied with the ever-present Union Army.
It was quite typical of Union and Confederate generals alike that when they were to spend any appreciable amount of time in a locality during, say, the winter when the armies weren't moving, they would find a comfortable local home to use as their headquarters. Certainly that was the case here at Petersburg. When the Union Army first came in and set itself up, the Quartermaster General, General Rufus Ingalls, found one of the finest homes in the area, and he lived in pretty good style, much to the resentment of the soldiers in his command who said General Ingalls always looks after himself first. But U.S. Grant was a different sort of man. It's an example of the essential humility of Grant, that for the first months that he was here, he refused to take over a very comfortable house only a few hundred yards away. Instead, he lived outdoors, in his tent. Only when the winter came on and the weather became too cold for him to stay in the tent did he agree to move into this simple split-log home behind me, built by his soldiers, and there Grant will spend the balance of the winter of 1864-1865. His wife Julia will come to join him, and his son. They'll be the first family of the Army, a very common sight to the soldiers of the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James. And it's so typical of this man who never really became anything more than that old storekeeper from Galena, Illinois, who never could put on the airs of high station, instead staying in his cabin, being such a common sight to his soldiers, while at the same time mounting, maintaining, and overseeing the largest, most complex military enterprise that had ever taken place on the continent.
Wonderful old Blandford Church is one of the treasures of downtown Petersburg. Established in 1735 as an Episcopal church, it functioned until 1803, when a newer parish in downtown Petersburg made it obsolete. For decades thereafter, the church stood abandoned and alone. During the Civil War, positioned between the opposing lines, the church miraculously was hit only twice by shell fire in the long 9.5 months of battle. And then in 1901, the Ladies' Memorial Association of Petersburg inherited the building, and a wonderful second life began. Today, the church is one of the artistic wonders of America. 15 original Tiffany windows adorn the sanctuary in gorgeous color. 13 of the windows are memorials to each of the southern states. 3 of the windows are particularly beautiful. The first is a Louisiana window, where the purple robe of St. Paul was created by using cobalt. The Missouri window shows St. Peter in his robe, which is of crushed 24-karat gold. And the Mississippi window, the sheen in the robe of St. James the Less, is pure copper. It is, as I said, an artistic wonder in this country. Outside in the shadow of the church are the graves of 30,000 Confederate soldiers who died in defense of their state.
Nothing brought the war home to the people of the cities of Richmond and Petersburg the way the siege did. As capital of the Confederacy, of course, Richmond had been accustomed from the beginning of the war to being a target of Yankee armies. And back in the spring of 1862, General George B. McClellan's Army of the Potomac, much the same as the army now facing them, had gotten within sight of the church spires on the city's hills before Lee took command of the Army of Northern Virginia and forced him back. But this new threat from a larger, much more seasoned enemy, and led by a man like Grant, who had a reputation for not giving up, was a different matter altogether. Still, after the citizens got over the initial shock of the enemy approach and became more comfortable with the knowledge that at least Lee had stopped Grant at the trenches, then life returned to some semblance of normality. Indeed, as the siege dragged on from days into weeks and on into months, it even became a normal part of daily life. And often people could clearly forget that only a few miles or less away from them lay a deadly threat to their city and their nation. People even came to the front to visit relatives, to bring little luxuries to the soldiers, or even just to sightsee. They took pride in making do in cities now increasingly cut off from consumer goods. So-called starvation parties became social events. And just as elsewhere in the Confederacy, citizens found a patriotic pride in seeing just how little they could live on. Yet, as the winter of 1864-65 approached, and especially after the re-election of Abraham Lincoln in November signaled that the North was going to stay with the war to the end, Richmonders and Petersburgers increasingly realized that the end might be near. The cities themselves were still physically untouched by war, except for an occasional Yankee shell in Petersburg. But by the dawn of 1865, their inhabitants were increasingly scarred by their siege experience, by the tension of uncertainty and waiting. More than ever before, they understood that their fate depended not on their government now, but on Robert E. Lee and his army, and the people thus responded to every fluctuation at the front.
Late in March 1865, President Abraham Lincoln came here to City Point to confer with General Grant. The Union commander was extremely optimistic over the forthcoming spring offensive. He was convinced that at long last he could bring Lee, the Gray Fox, to bay. As Mr. Lincoln prepared to board his ship, General Grant looked at him and said, "Mr. President, when I catch him, what do you want me to do with him?" And Lincoln is supposed to have looked at Grant with a kindly expression and replied, "Let him up easy, let him up easy." By late March, the snows had melted. Hints of spring were in the air. Grant began working diligently to refit his soldiers and prepare them for a large climactic assault. Yet Lee was a man who always believed the best defense to be an offense. On March 25th, Confederates launched an unexpected attack on a segment of the powerful Union lines. Lee's last tactical offensive in the long 9.5-month siege of Petersburg came here at Fort Stedman. This ancient Union fortification in the long line that Grant established was picked purposefully for a number of reasons. One, the Confederates are only 150 yards away to the west, and so they would have a short distance to attack. Secondly, the fort was run down. During the winter of 1864 and 65, the walls had crumbled, and federal authorities were unable to send workers up to make repair because Confederate sharpshooters across the way would pick them off rather easily. Perhaps a major factor in why Fort Stedman was chosen for the point of attack is the simple fact that 1 mile to the east was the City Point Railroad, Grant's main supply line, a veritable Shangri-La if ill-clad and half-starving Confederates could reach it. And so on the morning of March 25th at 4 o'clock, General John B. Gordon led 11,000 men in 3 columns in an attack against the fort. Confederates easily overran the works, then fanned out north and south. However, with comparative ease, the massive Union Army responded and reinforcements poured into the area. By 8 a.m., the Battle of Fort Stedman was over. 1,600 Confederates had been killed or wounded. Another 1,900 Confederates had been captured. One Johnny Reb spoke for everyone, I guess, when he said that Fort Stedman was like a meteor flashing in the night, and when it went out, the night was darker than ever.
Grant knew that by the spring of 1865, all that was keeping Richmond and Petersburg alive was its last remaining rail link to the rest of the Confederacy. Take that and he would isolate the cities, cut off any escape for the government, and perhaps trap Lee. Better yet, take the South Side Railroad and he would force Lee out of his trenches and into the open, where Grant's by now considerable numerical and logistical superiority ought to bring decisive victory at last. Lee, too, knew he could not afford to lose that last rail line, and that's why he'd positioned almost a third of his army in the vicinity of Five Forks, an important crossroads where 5 roads intersected. In command, Lee placed General George E. Pickett, who did the best he could with the position in obeying Lee's order to hold at all costs. Late in March, Grant ordered Sheridan with his cavalry and General Gouverneur K. Warren's 5th Corps and part of Hancock's 2nd Corps to take that position. They struck on April 1st, outnumbering Pickett by nearly 2.5 to 1. After initial skirmishing and costly command confusion that would lead Sheridan to relieve Warren of his command on the field, the Yankees plunged into a wide gap separating Pickett from the main Confederate army and cut him off. More than 5,000 Confederates surrendered, and Pickett and the remnant would not be able to rejoin Lee for days, if at all. More to the point, the road to the South Side Railroad was now open. Grant just had to reach out and take it. The Richmond and Petersburg defenses would have to be evacuated and left to their fates, and the Confederate government began to pack its bags to flee. It was all nearly over.
The news of Union victory at Five Forks set off a tremendous celebration at military headquarters near General Grant's tent. The only person who didn't celebrate was Ulysses S. Grant himself, who disappeared into his tent and emerged with an order for his entire army to launch a frontal assault along the whole Confederate line on the morning of April 2nd, 1865. That assault was successful at this spot, known to history as the Breakthrough, as elements of the Union 6th Corps, some 14,000 strong, under the command of General Horatio Wright, fought for 15 minutes in brutal hand-to-hand combat with some 2,800 Confederates, North Carolinians, and Georgians. Ultimately, the Union Army was successful at this spot, setting off the final day of fighting at the Petersburg Campaign.
We Americans like to think that our heroes died high noon when the day is advanced and the sky's bright. Not so with General A.P. Hill. Little Pal Hill commanded the Petersburg half of General Lee's army, and for 9 months he and his men had hurled back one attack after another from General Grant, winning incredibly every battle of which they were a part. On the morning of April 2nd, 1865, Grant launched that massive attack which shattered Lee's lines. Hill was desperately trying to rally his columns when a Pennsylvania soldier took careful aim and fired. The bullet pierced Hill's heart, killing him instantly. It was 6:30 a.m. The morning dew was still on the ground. The end came in April. On the first day of the month, a massive Union force struck the extreme Confederate right at the road junction of Five Forks. The half of the Confederates who were not killed or captured fled from the field. Five Forks was the most lopsided Union victory of the long siege. When Grant learned of this success, he gave orders for a general attack along the entire line on the south side of the James. Battle came with the dawn of April 2nd. Southerners put up a strong fight. Grant suffered 4,000 casualties that day. Yet the simple fact was that Lee did not have enough soldiers to stem the flood. Slowly, broken parts of the Confederate line drifted backward. Around 1 p.m. on Lee's already battered western flank, the full Union 6th Corps assailed Forts Gregg and Whitworth. The two earthworks were modest and neglected. Barely 1,500 Confederates were there, but in the face of 8-to-1 odds, the Southerners fought desperately until overwhelmed by numbers. The fighting at Fort Gregg was so vicious that no participant on either side ever forgot it. Although Federals punched through Lee's lines in several places that day, Grant was unable to encircle Lee's fragments. Meanwhile, Lee had ordered Richmond and Petersburg abandoned. The badly wounded Army of Northern Virginia must fall back to the west and regroup. The siege of Petersburg had lasted 9.5 months. Total Federal casualties were 60,000, Confederate losses 38,000. 16 generals had been killed during the long stalemate. The campaign had been a day-by-day pecking and stabbing here and there, near and far, fought yesterday, today, and tomorrow. The busiest people in the long siege were the undertakers. In the darkness of Sunday night, April 2nd, what was left of Lee's army filed across the Appomattox River and slowly headed west. For hours, Lee stood on a rise above the north bank of the stream. He held the reins of travel in his hands as he patiently gave orders and encouragement to the soldiers filing past. The last man marched by. For a moment or two, Lee listened to the shouts of victorious Union soldiers and the exploding powder magazines in Petersburg. Then he mounted his horse and followed his army into the darkness. For the Confederacy, it was despair incarnate, a bitter April that would soon end at Appomattox Courthouse with the death of one country and the birth of a new nation, unified and indivisible.